Stop! The cold, sharp command echoed through the night. The flashlight beam blinded her, making her tired eyes squint in the harsh light. A police officer approached, his face set in suspicion. Out here at this hour? Papers. The woman lifted her head, about to speak, but her throat tightened, words stuck in her chest. In an instant, she was roughly yanked toward the curb, a heavy hand pushing her shoulder down onto the cold ground. She's resisting. Take her to the station. The old necklace slipped from her jacket pocket, rolling down the gravel street. Her eyes widened, but before she could bend to pick it up, a heavy boot stomped down, crushing the last remnants of her past. The police car door slammed shut, and darkness swallowed her whole, leaving her in the suffocating confinement of the squad car. A fateful night, an accusation, and a deadly secret waiting to explode in the courtroom. This story will change the way you see justice. Don't forget to hit subscribe so you don't miss the next heart-stopping turn of events. The night sky descended over the slums like a grim curtain, swallowing up the faint light that lingered. The narrow alleys, dark and endless, seemed like tunnels leading into oblivion. The streetlights flickered erratically, sometimes going completely dark, leaving cold shadows to envelop every corner. In the distance, chaotic sounds erupted from an old tavern where drunken men laughed loudly before stumbling off into the night. At a street corner, a police car flashed its red and blue lights, but no one knew if it was there to solve anything or simply on another pointless patrol in an area where no one truly cared about justice. Eliza walked slowly down the damp street, her old shoes nearly useless against the bone-chilling cold. She pulled her faded coat tighter around her, trying to shield herself from the sharp winds that whipped through the old buildings lining the street. With every step, the crunch of debris and broken bottles echoed beneath her feet. Her face was etched with the deep lines of time, but it was her eyes that told the real story. Eyes that had long been accustomed to pain, indifference, and wounds that would never heal. She wasn't wandering aimlessly. Her steps had purpose, though they seemed slow and hesitant. Each time she turned into a narrow alley, she glanced behind her, as if afraid someone was following. But who would care about a woman in rags in the middle of the night? Or was she running from some ghost of her past? A stray cat leaped from a nearby dumpster, startling Eliza into stopping. It stared at her with cold green eyes before vanishing into the darkness. An uneasy feeling rose in her chest, but she had no choice but to press on. Her goal was just ahead, but would she make it before it was too late? Eliza's fingers instinctively reached for the necklace in her jacket pocket, clutching it as if it were the only anchor in this cold, indifferent world. The tarnished silver pendant, marked with scratches and scuffs, held the weight of a distant past. Just touching it, she could feel the burden of a moment that had changed her life forever. A strong gust of wind blew through, carrying the biting cold of the night. But what made Eliza shiver wasn't the chill. It was the hazy memories that began to stir within her. In her mind, blurry images flickered like an old film worn by time. A large room with a soaring ceiling, heavy wooden benches, the sharp, cold clang of a gavel. Little Eliza, only 10 years old, standing alone among strangers, her eyes wide with panic. In front of her, a young man sat slumped in the defendant's chair, his face pale, his hands clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. He didn't dare look at her, but she saw it all. The fear, the despair, and something deeper, the helplessness. "Are you sure?" A voice broke through, pulling little Eliza back to reality. It was the lawyer, the only person in the room who seemed to care about the truth. She swallowed hard, her small hands trembling as they clenched together. She had seen it all. She knew that young man wasn't the murderer, but she also knew that if she spoke up, her life would never be the same. Another cold gust whipped against her skin, dragging Eliza back to the present. She stopped in the empty street, her hands still gripping the pendant in her palm. The greatest question echoed in her mind, a question only she could answer. Who had she once been, and what had driven her to this point? Eliza's steps faltered as a pair of headlights pierced through the darkness, blinding her like the eyes of a predator locking onto its prey. The hum of the engine grew louder, and she instinctively froze, a chill running down her spine. From the corner of her eye, she saw the police car draw near, the flashing lights illuminating the night, casting long, cold shadows on the damp streets. She barely had time to gather her thoughts before a voice, sharp and commanding, shattered the silence of the alley. "Stop!" The command cut through the night like a blade. Eliza's heart raced as the bright light from the police car struck her face, making her squint and shield her eyes. Her breath quickened, and she felt her body tense. A heavy figure stepped out of the car, his boots crunching against the gravel as he moved toward her. The officer's uniform was pressed tightly against his muscular frame, and his eyes were cold and calculating as they scanned her up and down, scrutinizing every inch of her. "Out here at this hour?" he asked, his tone laced with suspicion. "Where's your ID?" The words hit her like a slap in the face. Her throat tightened, and for a moment, Eliza couldn't breathe. Her fingers instinctively sought the cold, familiar metal of the necklace in her pocket, clinging to it like it was the only thing that still connected her to a life she once knew. But ID? She had nothing. She had been stripped of everything save for the tattered coat on her back and the memories that haunted her every step. I'm not causing trouble," Eliza stammered, trying to find her voice. Her mind raced, but the words wouldn't come out right. She could feel her body trembling, the bitter cold of the night sinking into her bones. "I'm just passing through." Before she could finish, the officer scoffed, his lips curling into a derisive sneer. "Passing through," he mocked, his voice rising in a harsh, contemptuous laugh. "A homeless woman wandering the streets in the middle of the night? Do you think I'm stupid?" He took a step closer, his face inches from hers, his breath hot and foul. "Where's your story? You think you can just make up some excuse and get away with it?" Eliza flinched, her pulse hammering in her chest. The officer's eyes were filled with nothing but disdain, and it was clear that he saw her as nothing more than a nuisance, a problem to be dealt with. He towered over her, his presence suffocating. His words hit like a storm, each one like a punch to the gut. "Are you resisting arrest?" he barked, his voice rising in volume and authority. "You're hiding something, aren't you? Drugs? A weapon? What's it going to be, huh?" The world around Eliza seemed to spin, and she clenched her fists, her fingers tightening around the necklace until her knuckles turned white. The cold metal bit into her skin, but it was the only thing that grounded her, the only thing she had left. She knew that resisting would only make things worse. Her heart pounded in her chest, and she could feel the weight of the officer's judgment pressing down on her. I don't have anything," she whispered, her voice shaky. "I'm not resisting." But her words fell on deaf ears. The officer wasn't listening. He didn't care. With a swift motion, he reached for his radio, his fingers brushing against the cold metal. His voice was cold and emotionless as he spoke into the device. "Uncooperative subject. Take her to the station." No more words were needed, no more explanations. The officer's mind was already made up. Without warning, his hands grabbed her roughly by the shoulders, shoving her down to the ground with a force that left her gasping for air. The cold asphalt scraped against her skin, but she didn't feel it. She didn't feel anything anymore, not as the officer's grip tightened, not as he pressed her face into the ground, not as the darkness of the night seemed to swallow her whole. All she could hear was the sound of her own heart racing in her chest, and the haunting truth that echoed in her mind like a bitter refrain. Justice had never belonged to the powerless. It had never belonged to someone like her. A violent shove sent Eliza stumbling face first onto the cold, unforgiving pavement. Her palms scraped against the gravel, the jagged stones digging into her skin with a sharp, relentless sting. But that pain, as raw as it was, couldn't compare to the crushing weight on her back. The officer's knee pressed heavily between her shoulder blades, forcing the air from her lungs and making it almost impossible to breathe. Her chest heaved, gasping for any semblance of air, but it felt as though the world around her was slowly closing in, tightening its grip. She tried to twist, to escape, to find any space to breathe, but each attempt was met with more forceful pressure. "Don't move," the officer's voice rang out, cold and commanding, as his knee dug further into her spine, flattening her against the asphalt. She felt her body surrendering under the force, her limbs stiffening from the pressure. Desperation clawed at her chest as she fought to gather enough strength to move, but before she could, another vicious blow landed on her shoulder. Her entire body jolted from the impact. "I told you to stay still," His voice boomed again, rising in anger as the pain from his strikes spread through her body, causing her to wince and groan in agony. It felt like her entire world was crumbling beneath her, and all she could do was lie there, pinned by his weight. Her wrists were gripped tightly, the cold metallic handcuffs digging deeper into her flesh with every movement. She could feel them cutting into her skin, the pressure growing unbearable, and yet she couldn't do anything to relieve the pain. The weight of her situation pressed on her mind just as heavily as the officer's knee on her back. I didn't do anything wrong, she tried to speak, her voice hoarse and strained. But no one cared. No one was listening. Her words were lost, swallowed by the noise of the street and the indifferent eyes that passed her by. Around her, a few people walked past without a second glance. Some of them shook their heads. Others sneered, as though they were watching something they had seen countless times before. A homeless woman being taken down, dragged through the dirt. Their expressions were filled with apathy, as if her pain didn't matter, as if she didn't matter. And in that moment, Eliza realized they weren't even interested in the truth. They were just spectators to the cruelty of the world, too accustomed to injustice to feel anything at all. One man from across the street even let out a chuckle, pulling out his phone to record the scene. Another one causing trouble, he muttered under his breath, his voice dripping with mockery. As she was yanked across the ground, her jacket caught on something sharp, and the necklace that had been her only possession slipped from her pocket. It clattered against the pavement, its silver chain catching the faint glow from the dim streetlight overhead. Eliza's eyes followed it, her heart sinking as the delicate pendant rolled across the ground. It stopped just under the officer's boot, the small item now at the mercy of the man who had already taken everything else from her. The officer didn't even look down. Without a second thought, he stepped forward, his heavy boot landing directly on the necklace, crushing it beneath the sole of his shoe. The cold metal bent and cracked under his weight, grinding the last remnants of her past into the dirt. Eliza's breath caught in her throat as she watched the last connection to her former life disappear beneath the weight of his boot. Her eyes were wide, her vision blurry with tears, but she was powerless. She couldn't move, couldn't do anything but watch as her past was trampled and destroyed in front of her. The officer pulled her to her feet, roughly dragging her toward the waiting police car. His grip on her arm was tight and unforgiving, like she was a piece of garbage to be discarded. Her body swung helplessly as he hauled her toward the vehicle. Every step felt like a hammer strike against her heart, the weight of her situation bearing down on her with every move. The night was suffocating, the sounds of the city blurring into an endless cacophony. The distant laughter of strangers mixed with the screeching sirens, each sound amplifying the sense of isolation and helplessness that filled her chest. As they reached the police car, Eliza heard the laughter of those passing by, heard the muttered comments of those who found amusement in her suffering. But their laughter didn't matter. It was the deep, gnawing silence in her soul that terrified her. She had been reduced to nothing more than an object of ridicule, and no one cared. The officer shoved her into the back of the car, slamming the door shut behind her. The metal of the door felt cold against her skin, and the cramped, suffocating space inside seemed to close in around her. She sat there motionless, her hands still cuffed in front of her, the weight of everything she had lost crashing down on her all at once. Her chest tightened as she struggled to hold back the tears that threatened to spill. The world outside the car continued on, indifferent to her pain, and in that moment, Eliza realized something she had known all along. Justice had never belonged to people like her. It never would. She was invisible in the eyes of the world, just another casualty in a system that didn't care, a system that would grind her down just like the officer had ground her necklace into the dirt. And as the car pulled away, her fate sealed in the back of the police vehicle, she knew that the world would continue to spin on, leaving her behind in the shadows. The interrogation room door slammed shut behind Eliza, the sound echoing through the small, cold space with a finality that rattled her. The dim fluorescent lights overhead hummed incessantly, casting a harsh, lifeless glow on everything beneath them. The walls were bare, painted a dull gray, as though stripped of any personality, any warmth. The air was thick with the stale remnants of cigarette smoke clinging to the walls and the old furniture, mingling with the scent of sweat from those who had occupied this room before her. It felt like a place where time stood still, where human stories were reduced to ink on paper and forgotten the moment they were written. The room was almost entirely empty, save for a cold metal table at the center. Its surface was scratched and marked from years of use. There were two old wooden chairs, their legs squeaking with every slight movement, as if even the furniture was protesting its role in this sterile environment. The small space felt suffocating, its air thick with tension, as though it too was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Eliza sat on one of the chairs, her back stiff from the uncomfortable position, her wrists bound behind her with cold, painful handcuffs. She could feel the metal digging into her skin, the flesh around her wrists swollen and bruised from the pressure. Her fingers were numb, the blood flow restricted, but she didn't care anymore. The physical pain was nothing compared to the weight of everything that had led her here, the crushing despair that filled her chest and made it hard to breathe. Her body ached, but her heart felt heavier, burdened by the thought that this would be her reality for the rest of her life. As she sat there, her eyes scanning the cold gray walls, the door swung open, and the officer stepped in. His presence was a sharp contrast to the silence of the room. He held a stack of papers in his hand, his expression unreadable as he walked over to the table and threw the papers down in front of her with a resounding thud. The sound seemed to pierce through the stillness, making her flinch despite herself. "Homeless, no ID, refuses to cooperate with the police," he read aloud, his voice devoid of any emotion. He spoke as though he had done this 1,000 times before, as though the words meant nothing more than a rote recitation of facts. Each word felt like a punch to her gut, each phrase a reminder of how she had been reduced to nothing more than a label. She was no longer a person with a past, a history, or a story. She was just another statistic, a faceless figure in a sea of forgotten lives. The officer didn't even look at her as he wrote something down on the papers, his pen scratching across the paper in a rhythmic motion that seemed to go on forever. He didn't care to hear her side of the story, didn't care to ask any questions. His mind was already made up. He had decided who she was before she even stepped into this room. "Got a criminal record?" he asked without looking up, his voice dry and disinterested. "Or are you just another junkie wandering the streets?" The words hit her like a slap, and she flinched involuntarily, her body stiffening as she fought to hold back the tears that threatened to spill. She didn't respond. What was the point? She had heard it all before, the accusations, the assumptions, the labels. She had been here countless times, dragged into this cold, sterile room, sitting under the harsh lights while they wrote her off, judged her without a second thought. She knew how this went. She knew how it ended. She knew that no one cared enough to hear her side, to see her for who she really was. She glanced down at her hands, still bound by the cuffs, her fingers trembling with exhaustion and the weight of her own helplessness. She had nothing left to give, no fight left in her. All the years of being treated like a shadow, a ghost in a world that refused to acknowledge her, had drained the will to resist from her. As the officer scribbled something on the paper, Eliza could feel her mind wandering. She wasn't really here anymore, not in the way she used to be. She had been broken down over the years, piece by piece, until there was nothing left of the person she once was. She had tried so many times to find a way out, but each time the world had slammed the door shut in her face. Each time, she had been left with nothing but her past, a past that was slowly being erased by the cruel, indifferent hands of a society that had long since given up on her. The officer didn't stop writing. He barely acknowledged her presence, as though she was nothing more than an inconvenience, a nuisance that needed to be dealt with before he could move on to the next case. He didn't care that she was a human being, that she had a story, that she had a history. To him, she was just another problem to be solved, another statistic to be filed away. The silence stretched on, heavy and suffocating, and Eliza sat there motionless, her mind racing. She wanted to speak, to say something that would make a difference, but she knew it would change nothing. Her voice would be lost in the sea of apathy that surrounded her. No one would hear her. No one would care. As the officer finished his report, he slid the papers across the table without so much as a glance in her direction. He didn't need to ask her any questions. He had already decided who she was, and nothing she said could change that. Eliza sat there for a long time, staring at the table in front of her, her mind adrift in a sea of dark thoughts. The weight of everything, The years of hardship, the years of being ignored, the years of fighting a battle she could never win, felt like it was suffocating her. She wanted to scream, to rage against the injustice, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she sat there in silence, feeling as if she had already disappeared, already become nothing more than a forgotten name on a report. But as the minutes ticked by, something inside her stirred, a small, quiet voice that refused to be silenced. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make her sit up a little straighter, to look at the officer, to breathe just a little deeper. She wasn't done. Not yet. She wouldn't let them bury her, not without a fight. The interrogation room door creaked open once more, but this time it wasn't another officer. A young man, sharply dressed in a black suit, though with an air of urgency about him, stepped inside. The leather briefcase he carried swung lightly against his hip as he moved, his sharp gaze scanning the piles of paperwork on the table before settling on Eliza. He pulled a chair out, sitting down with a fluid motion, placing his briefcase on the table and clasping his hands together as if weighing something carefully. "My name is Daniel Carter, public defender. I'm here to represent you," he said, his voice calm but carrying an underlying sense of haste, as though he were racing against time. "They say you were arrested for resisting the police, but I've looked over the report, and frankly, this looks like a clear case of abuse of power." He glanced briefly at the officer standing nearby, whose arms were crossed, a sneer playing on his lips. "She's homeless, has no ID, and argued with the police. Someone like her, does she really deserve to be defended?" The officer mocked, leaning back against the wall. Daniel ignored him, turning his attention back to Eliza. "You have the right to take this to court. If you agree, I'll do everything I can to ensure they don't walk all over you." But Eliza remained silent. She looked at him, but there was no spark of trust or hope in her eyes. She had heard too many promises, seen too many people abandon her when it mattered most. "I have nothing to lose," she whispered, her voice hoarse and rough. "But I don't have anything to protect either." Daniel leaned forward, his voice softer now, yet unwavering. "You think so? But I don't believe that." He gently pushed the file towards her. "You don't have to say anything right now, but I have a feeling this case. It's not as simple as it seems." Eliza stared at the file in front of her, her gaze drifting down to her hands, where the trembling fingers absent-mindedly reached into her coat pocket. She felt the cold, worn necklace between her fingers, the metal smooth but heavy with years of history. For a brief moment, a flicker of doubt passed through her hazy eyes. She didn't know why she was agreeing to this, why she felt a strange pull toward him, but there was something in the way Daniel spoke, a determination in his tone that made her wonder if maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the end for her. Maybe this was an opportunity that he unknowingly had just touched upon, one that had the power to change everything. Her fingers tightened around the necklace, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Eliza allowed herself to entertain the smallest inkling of hope. The first trial was underway. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with tension as the police officer took the witness stand. He stood tall, his posture rigid and confident, with his hands clasped behind his back, as if this were nothing more than a routine procedure. "I was just following the protocol," he began, his tone firm, not a hint of hesitation in his voice. "When I found the defendant wandering the area in the middle of the night, she was uncooperative, constantly evading questions and refusing to provide identification. I had no choice but to restrain her for safety reasons." The prosecutor nodded approvingly, urging him to continue. "And how did she respond when she was arrested?" The officer shrugged, lowering his voice as though he were speaking about a dangerous criminal. "She became aggressive, struggled, and started shouting. I tried to de-escalate the situation but had to use force to prevent any further risk." He paused, his eyes scanning the room, waiting for a reaction. A few heads nodded in agreement, and hushed whispers began to ripple through the crowd, building an atmosphere that was clearly stacking the odds against Eliza. Daniel, the only one seated silently, gripped his pen tightly in his hand, his sharp gaze following every word of the officer's testimony, every lie being spun as if it were an undeniable fact. Eliza, sitting behind the defendant's table, lowered her head. No one looked at her, no one cared who she really was. To them, she was just a homeless wanderer, a worthless name. This was the narrative they had already decided for her the moment she was dragged into this courtroom. The scales of justice were tipping in favor of the powerful, and the crowd seemed caught in a perfectly crafted story. She felt the weight of their judgment pressing down on her, as though she were invisible to their eyes, a mere backdrop to the performance unfolding. The officer's words were being accepted without question, and Eliza's truth, her voice, seemed to vanish into thin air, swallowed by the injustice that surrounded her. The battle was already half lost, but she couldn't help but feel the quiet flicker of resistance growing within her, fueled by the silent support of Daniel, who refused to let her story be buried without a fight. Despite the mounting odds, Eliza felt a strange calm settle within her. She wasn't done yet. Eliza sat frozen in place, her frail shoulders trembling slightly beneath the worn, tattered coat that hung loosely around her frame. Her head was bowed, her eyes downcast, deliberately avoiding the gazes of everyone in the courtroom. The weight of the accusations piled on her, each word a sentence already handed down, as if her fate had been decided the moment she stepped into this room. It was as though she had never been given a chance to defend herself, to explain, to be seen as more than a homeless woman, a criminal, a nobody. The courtroom was suffocating, its oppressive atmosphere pressing down on her, stealing her breath with every passing second. Daniel, seated beside her, appeared equally stiff, his jaw clenched tightly, his brow furrowed in concentration as he flipped through the pages of the case file in front of him. He moved through the papers with a sense of urgency, yet the truth was clear. Nothing in that file was strong enough to disprove the officer's testimony. Nothing in it could erase the lies that were being presented as facts. The truth had been buried beneath the weight of their assumptions, and the powerlessness Daniel felt was almost palpable. His hand gripped the file with such force that his knuckles turned white, betraying the storm of frustration he was struggling to control. Around them, the room filled with whispers. The eyes of the courtroom were locked on Eliza, but there was no compassion in those stares, no empathy, no understanding, just judgment. No one stood to defend her. No one questioned the officer's testimony. A few of the onlookers shook their heads. Some even rolled their eyes, dismissing her as just another troublemaker who didn't deserve to be taken seriously. The prosecutor, standing with a smug expression, crossed his arms, his eyes glancing toward Daniel with an air of triumph. It was as if he was daring Daniel to find a hole in his case, challenging him to prove the officer's words wrong. The prosecutor's victory seemed inevitable. His gaze lingered on Eliza, a woman stripped of her identity, her voice silenced by a system that had already made up its mind about her. She was just a homeless woman with no name, no papers, no history worth listening to. The law wasn't on her side. The law wasn't designed for someone like her. It never had been. And in that moment, the weight of that truth was unbearable. Eliza knew it. She had known it for years. She was all too familiar with the silence that surrounded her, the cold, dismissive stares of people who saw only the surface, the judgment that clung to her like a second skin. They didn't see her struggles, her battles, her fight to survive. They didn't see the woman beneath the layers of shame and neglect. They saw only the image they had created for her. They had already decided who she was, who she would always be. She could stand up, shout, scream into the void that they were wrong. But would anyone care? Would anyone listen? A sharp pang of hurt rippled through her chest as she thought back to all the times she had tried to explain, to defend herself, to make them see her as more than the labels they had placed on her. The time she had pleaded with the world to understand, only to be met with further rejection, ridicule, and cruelty. She had tried to fight before, but it never made a difference. The system was built to crush people like her, and no matter how much she struggled, no matter how hard she tried, the walls would always close in around her. There was no escape from this cycle. Maybe this was just her fate, to be forgotten, to be dismissed, to be trampled beneath the weight of a world that had never cared for her. She felt that reality slowly closing in around her, suffocating her with its crushing finality. This wasn't a fight she could win. She was powerless. She always had been. And now, as the prosecutor's words continued to echo in her mind, she wondered if she had ever really stood a chance. Daniel leaned over slightly, his eyes flickering with concern as he looked at her. For a brief moment, he met her gaze, and she saw the worry etched into his face. He opened his mouth, perhaps to say something comforting, but the words came out as a whisper, quiet and uncertain. "We still have a chance," he said, his voice carrying the faintest note of hope, though it was clear he wasn't sure if he believed it himself. Eliza didn't answer. She couldn't. The words felt meaningless in her mouth. The hope in Daniel's voice felt like a fleeting illusion, something that could dissolve with the slightest touch. She didn't want to hope anymore. Hope had never done anything for her. Hope had only led to more disappointment, more pain. But still, something within her stirred, a faint flicker, a small part of her that refused to accept defeat. The air in the courtroom was thick, suffocating. The tension was palpable. Everyone knew how this was going to end. The jury, the prosecutor, the officer. Everyone had already made up their minds. Eliza was guilty, and nothing could change that. Her past, her status as a homeless woman with no identity, had already sealed her fate. And yet, as the prosecutor's voice rang out again, a wave of determination swept over her, just as quiet as it was fierce. Maybe this was not the end. Maybe there was still something left to fight for. Maybe the system had already judged her, but Daniel hadn't given up yet. And for the first time in a long time, Eliza felt that tiny spark of resistance flicker to life in her chest. She wasn't done. Not yet. She would fight, even if it was just for the smallest chance to be seen for who she truly was. The air in the courtroom seemed to grow thick, almost suffocating, as the judge's gavel struck down with a decisive bang. The sound echoed off the walls, sharp and final, signaling the last chance for the defendant to speak. Daniel turned to Eliza, his eyes filled with concern, but she remained eerily still, her gaze lowered, refusing to meet anyone's eyes. The room, filled with tension, was already bracing for her silence. Everyone thought she would remain as she had been, slumped, defeated, offering no defense, just like every other homeless person who had been crushed under the weight of the law. But then, a surprising shift occurred. Slowly, Eliza raised her head. Her movements were deliberate, almost calculated. Her frail hands, shaking slightly, reached toward the table. Her fingers gripped the edges as if drawing strength from the cold metal beneath her. The room held its breath as her eyes slowly lifted, no longer tired, no longer resigned. There was something different in her expression, an energy, a fire, an unmistakable resolve. The softness that had defined her up until now was gone. A spark of something raw, something powerful, replaced it. She stood up, her body swaying like it might collapse at any moment, but the strength in her voice was undeniable. "I am Eliza Thompson." Her name echoed through the room, quiet but firm. To the people in the courtroom, it meant nothing, but the way she said it carried a force far greater than anyone anticipated. It was as if she had ripped a veil from her past, a weighty history now standing in the open. A few murmurs rose in the background, confused whispers, but no one truly understood the gravity of the words she had just spoken. Eliza's trembling hands fumbled in the pocket of her coat, slowly pulling out something small and delicate, a tarnished silver necklace. As she held it up, its faint gleam caught the harsh lights of the courtroom, its surface worn and faded from years of use. A sharp gasp broke the silence from a corner of the room. A few heads turned, eyebrows raised, as if they sensed the shift in the air. With deliberate slowness, she clasped the necklace tightly in her hand, then locked eyes with the officer standing at the witness stand. He had been standing with pride, confidence radiating from his every movement, his back straight as he delivered his testimony. But now, as Eliza's eyes fixed on him, something began to change. His chest tightened, his shoulders stiffened. 40 years ago, Eliza's voice sliced through the room, her words measured but laced with an unsettling clarity. "I was the only witness to a murder. A case in which you, officer, were the one who was saved." Time seemed to halt in that instant. The very air in the room felt frozen, as if the world outside had stopped turning, as if everyone held their breath, waiting. The eyes of the entire courtroom shifted toward the officer, the confident man who had just moments ago stood as if he held all the power. But now, he was no longer the confident officer of the law. His face drained of color, his eyes widened, and for the first time, the arrogance faded from his expression. His mouth went dry as the words hung in the air, his throat constricting. His hands shook involuntarily, tightening around the witness stand, his knuckles turning white. The room was silent, not a single sound except for the low, shallow breaths from the people in the gallery. The officer blinked rapidly, as if he were trying to process what he had just heard. He looked down at the witness stand, his hands now visibly trembling. For the first time in this entire trial, the truth of his fear was visible to everyone. The walls that he had so carefully built around his story were beginning to crack. And then, like a ripple, whispers spread throughout the room, low murmurs of confusion, of doubt. Some people exchanged looks, their expressions changing from skeptical judgment to uneasy realization. Daniel sat motionless, his eyes wide in disbelief. His hands had gone cold, his mind racing to process what he had just heard. He knew Eliza had been hiding something, but this revelation was far beyond what he had expected. A secret buried deep, one that had now come to light, shaking the foundation of everything that had been presented. The officer, the one who had stood with such certainty only moments ago, now stood frozen, his body rigid with fear. His facade had cracked, and now the court could see him for what he truly was. The lie he had told, the story he had woven to frame Eliza, was unraveling before everyone's eyes. For the first time, the courtroom could see the man who had tried to bury the truth standing in the light, vulnerable, exposed. The whispers turned into a murmur of disbelief. The room seemed to vibrate with the intensity of what had just been revealed. Eyes turned from the officer back to Eliza, some with shock, others with dawning understanding. The weight of her words hung heavily in the air. She wasn't just a homeless woman accused of petty crimes. She was someone who had witnessed a crime long ago, someone whose truth had been hidden beneath layers of lies. The officer clenched his jaw, but the terror was unmistakable. He couldn't hide it anymore. Not now. The silent fear that had been buried deep within him for so long was now exposed to everyone. And for the first time, he was the one on trial. The courtroom was no longer filled with whispers of judgment about Eliza. Now it was filled with the realization that something far deeper, far darker was at play. The officer's arrogance had been shattered, and the air was thick with the knowledge that the truth was finally coming to light. For the first time in a long time, Eliza wasn't just the accused. She was the one holding the key to a long-buried secret, and the room knew it. A wave of chaos erupted in the courtroom right after Eliza's shocking declaration. The murmurs grew louder, spreading like wildfire across the room as everyone tried to process the gravity of her words. The judge slammed his gavel down repeatedly, demanding order, but even he couldn't mask the confusion that flashed across his face. Daniel immediately stood, turning toward the evidence table with determination in his steps. "Your Honor," he called out firmly, his voice ringing through the room, cutting through the growing noise. "I request that we examine the case files from 40 years ago. If what my client says is true, this is not just a wrongful arrest, but a gross betrayal of justice." A court clerk rushed out of the room, only to return a few moments later with a thick file, its cover worn and the edges frayed from age. The entire courtroom fell into a tense silence as the judge took the file from the clerk, flipping through the yellowed pages with deliberate speed. He paused at a particular line, reading aloud, his voice carrying the weight of the revelation. Key witness, Eliza Thompson, 10 years old. A deathly stillness swept over the room. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap, reverberating off the walls. Daniel shot a quick glance at the police officer, and as expected, the man's face drained of color. His eyes darted around the room in panic, searching for a way to escape the tightening grip of the truth. No, this can't be," the officer stammered, stumbling backward, sweat beginning to bead on his forehead. She's lying. There's been a mistake." But no one in the room believed him anymore. The man who had so confidently accused Eliza, who had stood as the embodiment of law and order, now stood before them like a fraud, his mask ripped away in an instant. Another court official stepped forward, carefully cross-referencing the signature of the witness from back then with the current records. "Your Honor," the official said solemnly, "there is no mistake. The defendant, Eliza Thompson, was the sole witness who cleared this officer when he was a young man." The tension in the room was unbearable, like a string pulled taut to its breaking point. Some people in the gallery gasped. Others whispered in disbelief. Eliza's life, long buried in the darkness of neglect and abandonment, had been unearthed in an instant, not by a grand speech, but by one simple statement, a forgotten document, and the unrelenting truth. The officer opened his mouth, trying to protest, but the words stuck in his throat. His face twisted, desperate, but he could not form the arguments to defend himself. The truth was out, and there was no denying it anymore. The lies had been exposed, and the courtroom knew it. He had no more options, no more tricks to play. The truth had come to light, and this time, no one was going to help him hide from the consequences. The judge leaned forward, his gaze sharp and unyielding. The room waited in breathless silence, the scales of justice now tipping in Eliza's favor. The officer, once so confident, was now nothing more than a cornered animal, his fate sealed by his own actions. The silence in the room was deafening as everyone knew the next steps. Eliza's words had shattered the facade. The man who had once stood tall in his uniform now stood before the very court he had once deceived, with nothing left to protect him but the truth that had come too late. The air was thick with anticipation, but one thing was clear. Eliza's fight was no longer a battle for survival alone. It was a fight for justice, her justice. And this time, no one could take that from her. The judge placed the old file down on the table, his cold gaze sweeping over the courtroom before locking onto the police officer, who now stood motionless, stripped bare in front of everyone like a man caught in broad daylight. The silence in the room was so thick you could hear the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Once again, the judge's gavel came down with a sharp, final crack. Based on the new evidence presented and the truth that has been laid bare before this court, I hereby declare that all charges against the defendant, Eliza Thompson, are immediately dismissed. The courtroom erupted in an instant. Some people clapped, while others exhaled as though they had just been freed from a nightmare. But amidst the commotion, there was a heavy, almost palpable tension. Not everyone was celebrating. A few faces were contorted with anger, not because Eliza had been exonerated, but because of the injustice that had allowed this to happen in the first place. A woman had been wronged, her life lost, while the very person who should have been held accountable had ascended to a position meant to protect justice. The officer, Richard Evans, clenched his fists so tightly that his temples throbbed, his jaw set in a grimace as he struggled to hold himself together. "Your Honor," he blurted out, his voice laced with panic. She's just a homeless woman. Who can guarantee that her testimony is true?" But no one in the room was listening to him anymore. The prosecutor lowered his head, as if not wanting to be implicated in what had become an undeniable scandal. A court official leaned over and whispered something into the judge's ear, and the judge nodded solemnly. "Officer Richard Evans," he said, his voice growing darker, filled with an unyielding authority. "Based on the new developments in this case, I am formally requesting an internal investigation into your conduct. The police department will review all cases you've been involved in to determine whether there has been any abuse of power." All eyes turned to the officer, his face draining of color, beads of sweat forming on his forehead. This was the last thing he had expected. He had thought, no matter what happened, the system would protect him. But now, for the first time, the entire system was turning its back on him. It was a complete reversal of fortune. Eliza stood in her place, unmoving. There was no celebration, no satisfaction in her eyes. She simply gazed at the officer, the very man she had once protected from an unjust conviction, only for him to drag her into the abyss of injustice. When their eyes met, the officer quickly turned away, unable to bear the weight of the truth staring back at him. The room fell into another heavy silence. No one doubted the outcome anymore. Justice had been served, but at a cost no one could measure. The room was filled with the realization that Eliza had won, but the scars she carried would never be erased. The price of her fight for justice was too high to quantify, one that had already taken a lifetime, a soul, and a quiet dignity. For Eliza, this moment would be both a triumph and a tragedy. She had exposed the truth, but the cost of her victory was the heavy burden of all that she had endured. No applause or cheers could ever erase the deep wounds that had been carved into her over the years. The officer's fate was now sealed, but the questions that remained in Eliza's mind would never be fully answered. What had she truly gained in the end? Eliza stood there, her sharp gaze unwavering, showing no sign of excitement or elation after the victory. The room was still filled with hushed whispers and surprised reactions from the crowd, but she didn't care. Being exonerated, being recognized, didn't make her heart feel any lighter. She had grown so accustomed to loneliness and suffering that nothing could confuse or bring her joy anymore. When the judge asked Eliza to decide between compensation or personal benefits, some people in the room turned to her, hopeful that she would claim what the system owed her. But Eliza simply shook her head, walking slowly to the front, causing the air to grow heavy with silence. When her eyes met the officers, the one she had saved, the one who had caused her so much harm, she didn't feel anger. There were no more fiery bursts of rage, just sadness, a deep sense of disappointment. "I don't need money," Eliza said, her voice soft, without a trace of bitterness. She lifted her head, her eyes shining with quiet determination. "I didn't save you so you could become a bully." Her words echoed in the courtroom, and the atmosphere grew heavier than ever before. The officer stood frozen, his hands clenched tightly, his eyes full of regret and shame. Those around him began to understand that justice, though served, could never erase the pain Eliza had borne. There was no response from anyone. The room fell silent, the truth hanging in the air, thick and undeniable. Eliza turned away without the need for further words and quietly left the courtroom, her eyes focused straight ahead. Though she had been freed, she carried with her an unspoken burden. Justice could restore her name, but the things she had lost, her time, her innocence, her peace, could never be reclaimed. The officer stood motionless in the center of the courtroom, the sound of Eliza's footsteps now a distant memory. The room remained engulfed in a profound silence, as if time itself had frozen. His hands were clenched into fists, sweat beading on his forehead, but there was no longer any trace of the confidence or arrogance that had once defined him. Instead, all that remained was a deep emptiness, a profound humiliation. He had thought he could escape it all, had once believed that justice belonged only to the strong, to those like him. But now he was faced with a truth he could not deny, and it was the collapse of everything he had once been. Suddenly, without warning, he dropped to his knees. It wasn't a gesture forced by anyone's command, but a compulsion from deep within, a breakdown he couldn't control. His body crumpled as though every ounce of strength had evaporated from him in that instant. Tears began to fall, each drop like a hammer striking his very soul. No one spoke. No one moved toward him. Only the sound of his quiet sobs filled the silence, the tears falling like silent pleas for forgiveness that no one could offer. The image of a once powerful, confident man now kneeling, crying in regret, was a stark contrast to the person who had stood so assuredly only moments ago. He had been the one to push Eliza into the abyss of pain, the one who had trampled justice beneath his feet. He had lived for years under the illusion of his own invincibility, but now there was no one to blame. His conscience had awoken, but it was too late to undo the damage. All that remained was the shattering reality of his actions and a question that would never be answered. Can a man be saved when he has already destroyed himself? The audience remained silent, their eyes locked on the officer as he wept, but no one moved to comfort him. The painful conclusion of this trial couldn't change anything, yet it would leave a mark on every single person in the room. It would serve as a harsh reminder that justice is not just a concept, but something that must be protected and upheld, no matter the cost, no matter how late it comes. And sometimes, by the time justice is served, it is already too late to undo the wounds caused by its absence. Eliza stepped out of the courthouse, not in haste, not looking back, but walking steadily, as though each step she took was a firm affirmation of the truth that had finally been revealed. Despite the weight of all the pain, the injustices she had endured throughout her life, today she had achieved something few people ever would. She had fought not only for herself, but for all those who had been oppressed, ignored, and forgotten. Her every move echoed the resilience of a woman who had stood tall against the crushing weight of a system that had once tried to bury her. The light of the new day reflected on her face, and she held her head high, her eyes not just filled with determination, but with an unexpected kindness. She didn't need recognition nor fame. What mattered was that her actions had become a symbol, a living testament to empathy, to justice, to the idea that even one voice, one person, can change the course of a story. As she passed through the courthouse doors, a homeless boy sitting by the side of the street watched her. His eyes, once clouded with doubt and sadness, now burned with a spark of hope, a glimmer that had not been there before. It was as though Eliza had sparked something deep within him, showing him that one day, justice would come, and the powerless would no longer be subject to the cruelty of a world that turned its back on them. His gaze lingered on her, a sense of admiration and reverence in his eyes. Then, as if moved by something far more powerful than mere curiosity, he stood up, watching her retreating figure until she was swallowed by the crowd. In that moment, Eliza had unknowingly become more than just a woman who had fought for herself. She had become a symbol, a beacon of hope for a generation yet to come, a living reminder that even the smallest act of defiance could change the world. The boy, who had seen so much suffering and indifference, now had something to hold on to, something to fight for. Though Eliza was unaware of it, a new spark had been kindled in the heart of a young boy, one who would grow up knowing that justice could prevail. And that spark would spread, igniting others along the way, teaching them that no matter the odds, standing up for what is right is never in vain. Eliza didn't seek glory, yet in the eyes of that boy, she had become something far greater, an embodiment of struggle, a beacon of hope, and a symbol of the courage to fight for what is just. She had become someone whose actions, in a single fleeting moment, had changed everything, not just for herself, but for a generation that would look back on her as a turning point, a person who, through one act of defiance, had shifted the course of destiny. Though her footsteps faded into the distance, their echoes would reverberate for years to come in the hearts of those who would one day remember her name, not as a victim of the system, but as its ultimate challenger. And that was a victory, one that could not be measured by fame, but by the lasting impact of her quiet revolution. Eliza's story quickly spread, reaching far beyond the confines of the courtroom, becoming a hot topic on media outlets and social networks. People from all walks of life shared her story, discussing the resilience of a woman who had fought not just for herself, but for all those forgotten by the system. The image of Eliza, a homeless woman standing up against injustice, became a symbol of forgiveness, courage, and hope. Articles, blog posts, and word of mouth began to mention her name as a powerful reminder of the need for justice and humanity in society. But Eliza's story didn't stop there. Even though she had been exonerated and the system had been forced to take responsibility, a big question still lingered in the hearts of everyone. Does justice truly exist, or is it just an abstract concept, something that those in power can impose as they wish? Did Eliza really win, or was she merely a wound on the body of society, a place where people could turn their backs when there was nothing left to fight for? The ending of Eliza's story left a haunting question in the minds of the audience. Even though she had been given justice, too many questions remained unanswered. She was a living testament to resilience, but at the same time, she was a stark warning about the injustice still present in the societal system. Can we truly change this world, or will it forever be consumed by unseen shadows where the vulnerable continue to bear the brunt of cruelty? Eliza's story will continue to live on in the hearts of everyone, a reminder that will never be forgotten. Her story wasn't just a tale of victory, but a reflection of the fight we all must face. A fight for fairness, for humanity, and for the courage to stand up against an unjust system. As long as the world continues to turn, her story will live, serving as both a triumph and a challenge to the generations that come. It will serve as a voice for the voiceless, a call to never turn away from the injustice that still lingers in the corners of society. Thank you so much for following Eliza's journey, for witnessing her fight for justice, and for the power of compassion. Her story is one of resilience, but also a call to reflect on the world around us and the inequalities that still persist. If her story has inspired you or made you think deeply about the world we live in, please don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Join us on this emotional journey and be part of the conversation. Your support means everything, and together, we can make sure these stories continue to be told. Thank you again for watching.